Good morning and welcome to Business Buzz. Coming up, Nigeria's central bank holds its benchmark interest rate steady for a second straight meeting. Oil slips below $90 a barrel as Washington and Tehran explore a fresh ceasefire. Petrol prices jump again at NNPCL stations, adding fresh pressure on households. And across Africa, the era of holding rates is fading as more central banks turn aggressive. I am Louisa Asidi. Stay with us. Welcome back. We begin this morning with two numbers shaping every Nigerian wallet. Inflation barely moved in June, easing to 15.91% from 15.93% the month before. In practical terms, it held steady, but the national figure hides a harder reality. In 19 states and the Federal Capital Territory, prices are rising by more than 30% a year. And on Tuesday, the central bank kept interest rates unchanged at 26.5% for the second time running. To make sense of what both numbers mean for ordinary people, I am joined by analyst Lucky Ekwesiri.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you here this morning. So we have a lot of questions for you. First of all, before we go further, let's start with something simple. What would you call inflation rate? What will you call interest rate? And how are those two rates connected?
Inflation rate is simply persistent increase in prices of goods and services in the country. And that's why the figure become very worrisome, because the CBN, the data people have put out there that inflation dipped slightly in the last month from 50.93 to 50.91. To me, that's no difference. So it's a persistent rise in the cost of goods and services in the country. Why the interest rate? Of course, as the name implies, interest is the rate at which you can borrow or lend in a country. And the CBN fixing of interest rate is to have that standard up there, which means banks, when they want to lend to others, they cannot lend below it, but they can lend above it. So that's why that rate is usually a policy matter to regulate and control the economy.
Okay, now looking at what the national figure says about the inflation rate, you have about 16% nationally. But when you look at 19 states, Abuja, and prices are rising to more than 30% a year. Now, why do you think there's that huge gap? And which number actually reflects what Nigerians are experiencing?
If you ask me, I would say even the prices in other states that are rising at 42% do not really reflect what Nigerians are experiencing. I do think that is above that. But that is not to say the data are wrong. But I just want to say, because the everyday Nigerian person, when we talk of inflation, is what you experience in the marketplace every day. You and I, we buy things every time. You go, you buy bread, you buy some other things, your household things, the food you eat. Have the prices come down? Over the last 1 year, can you say authoritatively that these prices have been lowered to an extent that you feel more comfortable? The answer is between you and you know very well that that is not the reality here.
Yes.
So, of course, I love the fact that the economic indicators are saying that the prices are going down. But what of the reality? Because if something cannot affect the common man in a positive way, that policy has not yielded its intended result, even though the numbers are there.
Okay, even as the headline rate flattened, food prices are still climbing higher month on month. You see food prices rising. So why is it that the overall rising rate of food prices, the figure, it's not the same? What would you say about that?
Let me address something. You see, the consumer price index with which the economists measure this inflation rate is like a basket wherein you have a lot of goods in it. I said the price of this, the price of this, the price of this. I think we have over 800 items that made up the consumer price index in Nigeria. Now, when you have all of that, the prices of all of these items will combine together to make that headline that you see or that you see around the nation. However, the individual price of the item in it is a serious determinant of what you pay in the market. For example, if the price of, let me say, a car, if it's part of the food basket, is increasing sporadically, but the price of computers have gone down. Now, if you sell more computers in that month, you're going to have a reduced price because of the average, but the price of cars haven't gone down. And because of this, you have these differences in the state compared to the national average because the weighting of each of these items differ from state to state. Okay. And then you have the consumer behavior, the pattern of consumption differ from state to state. So that's why you're having these differences here and there.
Okay, the central bank, they kept the interest rate at 26.5%. Now, if inflation at least is not rising, why not bring the rates down? And what does a rate that high do to an ordinary person with a loan or a small business owner trying to borrow? What does it do to them?
Sometimes it's difficult to explain some of these things without going into technicality. Let me say something about this. You see, when inflation seems to be rising in an economy, that is persistent increase and the prices of goods and what services.
Okay.
The central bank have to act by increasing rate. The intention is to slow down the economy because the assumption is that there is too much money chasing few goods. And if too much money is chasing few goods, the reality is that it will push prices up. So the central bank has to act by increasing rates. And what does rate increase do to people? When there are increases in the rate, people find it difficult to borrow because you wouldn't want to borrow at a rate that is above 30%, for example. How do you pay back? So he takes money away from the economy. And at the same time, because of that increase in rate, people find it attractive to save. So they push more money into the bank to be saved. That way, money will leave the economy. So fewer money in circulation, pursuing much goods, inflation rate is expected to fall or come down. But here is the caveat, and here is a problem with the issue of Nigeria. This very scenario that I've explained is a situation where you have a demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation. So you can easily control that with rates. But the problem we have in our economy is that our inflation is beyond demand pull. And that is the reason some of this rate that the CBN is giving is not having much effect. So the CBN should be able to look at a reality, keeping rate that way is actually meant to slow down the economy so that prices will drop. But the bigger issue is that do we really want to slow down the economy? Is the economy progressing at an exponential rate that we want to slow it down? The answer is no, because we are looking forward to growth. That's why the issue is. So the CBN, the government, have to look at what is driving the inflation in the economy in the first instance. Is it the demand pull deflation that is driving it? Or we have a structural inflation, a structural problem, or a cost push inflation? Because if these two are driving inflation figure in Nigeria, no matter the increase in rate that you're going to do, it will not bring down the prices as much as it should be. So the government need to look tactically at that and then look at how to control for that. That's the reality.
Okay, so now the central bank said something about the interest rate. So let's look at what they said.
Available evidence suggests that the Nigerian economy has remained largely resilient to the external shocks, reflecting the gains from prior reforms implemented by the fiscal and monetary authorities. Provide an opportunity to closely monitor incoming data and assess the trajectory of inflation to guide future policy decisions.
So, the central bank has said a lot about the interest rate. So, what do you say to the central bank on what they are trying to do?
It's quite very wonderful that the central bank is trying to keep. Of course, you see that I think from February till now, they've kept it at 26.5% because they are looking at stabilizing. We have a problem if inflation. So central bank may not be able to control their intended outcome or have their intended outcome with this approach that they are going for or giving out to Nigeria. So they need to look at an alternative approach.
Okay, so looking at the instability in the inflation rate across different states in Nigeria, you have some having a different interest rate, inflation rate amount, another some set of states having a different inflation rate account. What would you say would be the solution to that?
It's quite easy. You know, I said something before that one, the weighting in the different states resulted into that different figure. And then the behavior, the consumer behavior. What the solution is still fixing the core problems of inflation in Nigeria. What are the core problems of inflation in Nigeria? We have structural inflation. That is, when we talk about structural inflation, we are looking at the decay in the economy. We are looking at over the period, the decay in infrastructure, lack of production, and all of that. And then we have the cost push inflation. Here you have Nigeria, where you have in the production of goods and services today, everyone have to depend on the generating power, which is costly to themselves. And they have to do that to ensure that they keep afloat. And then they use generator that push the cost of production upward. And when you have that situation, there is no way that that cost can be eliminated. It has to be passed to the consumer. And that is where the inflation will come in, the instability will come in. We also have a problem in Nigeria. We are import dependent. We import a lot of goods to this country, consumable goods to this country. And the importation of goods is dependent on our exchange rate. If the Naira keeps depreciating, for example, the goods imported are going to come in with high cost. How do you reduce such prices? You cannot, obviously. So if we are looking at fixing it, we must look at these things, we must look at this alternative and be able to solve them. It's a long-term issue, not a short-term measure. What I've seen that the Central Bank of Nigeria is doing is a kind of short-term measure. Of course, they mentioned it, that the inflation decrease at the moment is temporary, and that's why they want to hold interest at that distance. It's the short-term measures to deal with the inflationary pressure on the economy. So we really need to look at the long-term solution, which is addressing this core issue that are driving inflation in Nigeria.
So you did say something about the main reason why we have inflations based on the consumer level is the fact that we depend highly on importing things that we can produce here. So if you're looking at the interest rate and the inflation, how would you solve all those?
You see, to me, the government are countering, the government agencies are countering themselves.
Okay.
And I will tell you why. Here in Nigeria, the government told us that they want to accelerate the economy. Now, acceleration of economy has to do with pushing more money into the economy, building of roads, encouraging industry to spring up and all of that. How do you do that? You have to lower interest rate for people to borrow. You have to lower the taxes so that people don't pay much tax. Maybe you give tax holiday to some, but basically interest rate. Now, when you lower the interest rate, you encourage people to borrow at a very cheap rate. For example, the rate in the US is around 3 point something percent, and then you have the rate in the UK, whatever they have borrowed. And then they use that money, put it into production, push it into the economy, and the economy is accelerated, growth is accelerated. But here we have the nation on a fiscal level trying to accelerate the economy, increase the GDP, increase the factors that make the economy work. And then we have, on the other hand, the monetary policy trying to pull away resources from the economy. You see the dilemma that we have here. So we're having counterproductive policies at play here. And until we come to ourselves an agreement where the fiscal policies would have to work with the monetary policy, we may not achieve the much needed results.
So if prices are still going up faster than most people's salary, when does this inflation ease? Like, what does it actually mean for the average Nigerian?
The meaning of it to the average Nigerian is quite simple. And I have to laugh because the salary is static, and then the prices are rising. The meaning is that your purchasing power is eroded. You can't purchase what you need to purchase. The implication is that the standard of living will drop. Okay. Increase in cost of living result into lower standard of living. That's why the ordinary Nigerian will tell you that, look, these figures are fake.
Yes.
Because it's not hitting them. It's not improving their standard of living. So they will tell you that the standard of living is how well you are living. Let me put it that way. How well you are living. Are you living fine? Are you living wonderful? Can you afford everything you need with ease? The cost of living is the price of those things that you want to afford to live well. So the average Nigerian does not understand the meaning of cost push, demand pull, structural, whatever you want to call it. They are not interested in that. They don't understand that. Does this thing affect my life positively? That's what they are interested in. So here we have this issue here. So today, the average Nigeria salary is creeping. The other time we talked about a minimum wage and they argue and all over the place. At the end of the day, we arrived at 70,000 naira. How much is a bag of rice today? So you see where the problem lies. How much is a basket of tomatoes? How much is a tuber of yam? How many would that be able to buy? How much is transportation? If I have to come into this studio today with probably public transport, how much will I spend? These are some of the things. So the income is almost static. The cost is rising. The meaning is that the standard of living is dropping rapidly.
Okay, so why does the central bank keep on trying to raise interest rates? Are they doing it to fight inflation? And how does it actually work?
They are looking at different types. It's not one. Let me mention just about 3 or something like that. We have the demand pull inflation. Okay. We have the cost push inflation. I've explained this earlier, and I can't explain them again. We have the structural inflation. The demand pull inflation is the belief that there is more money in the hands of people to spend. So it deals with spending. So when people spend a lot of money, we have much money pursuing few goods, so the prices go up. That is what the central bank is trying to curb. Demand pull. And the way to fix demand pull inflation is actually the use of interest rate. And the central bank actually knows that because we have what we call the OMO, open market operations. So they try to use those instruments to deal with these things. But like I said earlier, they have to understand that the inflationary trouble of Nigeria is not demand pull.
Okay.
It's structural / cost push. So this interest rate cannot deal with this type of inflation. That's why we're still having the problem. Tomorrow, the interest rate is head And we already explained that, look, holding the interest rate at that level actually means that factories are going to close because they can't finance themselves. New factories are not going to come up. Maybe the big companies, the oil tech, the oil industry, the tech companies, they may be able to afford it. But the reality is that SME will not be able to thrive. And what is the backbone of an economy is the small and medium scale what? Enterprises. So the CBN has to realize that they are dealing with something that does not have one face. So we must accept the reality that it is not only a demand pull inflation we are dealing with. We are dealing with a multifaceted inflation. So we must learn to say, look, this interest rate, whether leaving it constant or increasing it, is not going to solve our problems. We must look at the other aspect of it. If I were to advise, in reality, we should be able to pull down the interest rate so that the economy can be accelerated.
So from what you were saying, keeping interest rates high actually slows down
the economy.
Job creation and businesses, right?
Exactly. When you don't have money to start your business or to inject into your business, you can't open more branches. If you don't have more branches being opened or new business springing up, how do you employ people? That's the reason you see a lot of employment. People are struggling so hard to be in the government sector because they think that is where this whole thing, they can pay them with ease. Why? The economy is struggling, even though recently we are recording some growth, but it's struggling. So we must be able, if you keep the interest rate high, the economy will continue to struggle. And this is just one aspect of it because the CBN talks about the NPR ratio of bank. Of course, they talked about the implication is that you are further strangling the economy because you're saying that banks can only lend at more than 27%. And these banks, they want to make profit, so they will add at least 3 to 6% to whatever the central bank has done, which is a 26.50. They want to make more profit. And at the same time, you are saying that they cannot have access to at least 45% of their fund. That's the requirement that they have to hold with the central bank. If they cannot have access with at least 45% of their fund, that means they are left with 55% to loan out at, you see, a big problem here. People are not ready to borrow because the interest rate is too high. You can't pay it, and then the commercial banks do not have access to even what? Lend. So they are selective in their choice of what? Lending.
Okay, so looking at the inflation rates in general, why is it that food inflation rates are always higher than the overall rate of the inflation?
I will tell you.
Okay.
Logistic, transportation, energy cost, fuel cost. All these things affect food. If you look at the data that was given by the Central Bank of Nigeria, you were told that a state in the north has, in certain food item, if you look detailedly at the data that was given by the NBX, you discover that certain food items are cheaper in the northern region than in the southern region. Why? Because of what? This cost of what? Logistic, transportation, and all the other. In Nigeria, we have a situation where if anything happens to oil, that's petrol, and then energy, it pushes prices up. And we'll be told recently that the external shock, which is the trouble in the Middle East or whatever, has affected the economy. So that is the reason you're having this one. You and I will buy food every day. You can't live without food. If the prices of other these things go up, you can do without them. But you must eat. You have to live. Maybe after we finish this program, you want to go and take your lunch. It's natural. So that's the reason. And that's the reason we are much more concerned about the consumer all. Because it affects the generality of what? Nigerians.
Okay, for someone with a loan right now, looking at what is happening with the central bank, is there anything that changes for the person now or maybe later?
Well, the banking operation, you go into it, and when you are borrowing, it's with a strict, what is it called, agreement, an arrangement. So if you borrow at 5%, it's just an example anyway. If you borrow at 5%, it's not going to change, even though things what changed over time. You're still going to have that, except there is a clause in that your loan agreement that states that it should be reviewed from time to time. So for someone who is currently on loan, the struggle would be to meet up to generate a lot or enough revenue to be able to pay off that loan. But the new rate, of course, it's a really new rate. The rate has been constant over the past few months anyway. So it's not going to affect them anyway.
Okay. Looking at the different inflation rates across the different states in Nigeria, and if you notice, some states are having it better than the other states. So would you say that there's something that some other states are doing better than the others? What would you say about that?
We are dealing with food.
Okay.
Source of production matters. Then once a basket of tomatoes, which cost probably 5,000 naira in the northern region, will likely cost 8,000 naira here. So we're dealing with source of production here, where it is produced nearest to the marketplace. And at the same time, we are dealing with how the various states assign weight to these goods. For example, you cannot say the same weight should be assigned to alcohol in a Sharia state and alcohol here. So the weight assigned to them make these differences. Then the closeness or the nearness to the source of production also make the difference. That's why you're seeing these different figures happening here and there. But overall, it's affecting every Nigerian.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. I've had a wonderful time listening to you talk about the inflation rate. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We'll go on a break right now, and when we return, more Business Buzz. Welcome back. Looking at the stock market, trading on the Nigerian exchange reached 9.6 trillion naira in the 6 months to June, more than double the value recorded in the same period last year. Local investors led the charge, accounting for almost 88% of activity driven by banking recapitalization and strong corporate results. The exchange chief executive, Temi Popola, says Nigeria has the fundamentals to build one of Africa's leading capital markets, pointing to a young population and a growing pipeline of companies seeking capital. Now to monetary policy, where the Central Bank of Nigeria has left its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 26.5%. This decision came at the end of the committee's 360th meeting in Abuja, with all 711 members in attendance. Also, the hold keeps the bank's tight stance in place as policymakers work to sustain slowing inflation and steady the foreign exchange market. For households and businesses in the year. It's time now for a break. When we come back, more business buzz. Have pulled back. Yes, crude retreated on yesterday after reports that the United States and Iran were exploring a new ceasefire, easing fears of an immediate supply shock. Meanwhile, Brent traded at just over $88 a barrel, down from $90 a day earlier. Also, diplomats are said to be seeking a 10-day truce to revive talks that collapsed after renewed hostilities, though neither side has signaled major concessions. Now to the pump, where petrol prices have risen again, with NNPCL raising the price of premium motor spirits by 115 naira per litre. This rise follows Dangote Refinery's move to resume selling refined products in dollars, adding fresh uncertainty to the downstream market, with some NNPCL and MRS stations reported closed on Monday. We have a video to look at from the NNPC. Let's see what they say.
And right now, Dangote Refinery, provided we continue to get access to Nigerian grades with the support of Nigerian government and NNPC, albeit at internationally benchmarked prices, we will continue to process that oil and serve the domestic market with priority. And that is happening as we speak. There is uninterrupted supply to the Nigerian economy for all of its refined fuels requirements. So right now, can we expect further price increases? I cannot guarantee that. We are not in the business of maintaining flat supply. That is the role of government if they want to intervene in the economy when it comes to the cost of energy. What we can assure, what is in our control, is that we will continue to ensure that Nigeria enjoys fuel abundance of high quality fuels, but at internationally commodity-related benchmark pricing.
For consumers, further pump price rises threaten to feed directly into transport costs and household budgets. In Nigeria today, there is a strong appetite for government debt. The Debt Management Office drew bids worth 1.7.4 trillion naira at its July bond auction, allotting just over 929 billion naira across 3 federal bonds. Demand was strongest for the longer-dated 2037 bond as investors moved to lock in attractive yields. Separately, the Finance Minister, Taiwo Oyedele, told the Senate that reports of 80 trillion naira in fresh borrowing were exaggerated, explaining that much of the increase reflects the naira's depreciation and the former recognition of old liabilities, rather than new loans. The heavy bond demand points to sustained investor confidence, even as the government works to explain the true scale of its debt position. It's time now for another break, and when we return, we'll look at the Nigerian power sector. There is a signal to investors in the Nigerian power sector as the federal government says it has paid 333 billion naira to 8th-generation companies and confirmed the first bond coupon, about 63.5 billion naira, was paid on schedule. Also, a second bond worth around 729 billion naira is now planned to clear more legacy debts. However, power producers have pushed back, warning that a further 7 trillion naira in fresh liabilities could build up before the program is even completed, and are calling for a more sustainable long-term solution. Restoring trust in the sector's finances remains a work in progress, even as the government points to early signs of improved liquidity. Staying with energy, 13 of the 50 oil and gas blocks offered in Nigeria's licensing round returned to the basket after failing to attract bids, though regulators point to strong overall interest, with 143 companies submitting around 200 bids. Separately, the industry regulator says Nigeria remains on course to reach 3 million barrels of crude a day by 2030, helped by faster approvals and a rising output from indigenous producers. Together, the two stories capture a sector in transition where some assets are struggling to attract capital even as production climbs towards a 4-year high. However, Nigeria's ability to convert reform into output will shape government revenue for years to come. In brief now, onto few more stories making the business news headlines today. The Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise has warned that corruption and political interference could undermine the government's new social intervention programs, and is calling for stronger safeguards around fund disbursement and beneficiary selection. Also, technology executives say millions of Nigerian small businesses remain tools. In Nigeria's 3-year-old national blockchain strategy, once the strategy is targeted at unlocking $40 billion in value, what remains is largely unimplemented as attention shifts instead to cryptocurrency regulation. Meanwhile, in East Africa, Uganda's export earnings rose 13% in May, which was boosted by a surge in gold and to trucking as the country builds out its position in the global battery supply chain. We'll go on one more break, and when we come back, we'll look at Africa at large. Now to a shift that is underway across the continent. Africa's brief pause on interest rates is drawing to a close as a growing number of central banks once again put fighting inflation ahead of growth. Ethiopia last week raised its rate for the first time in 2 years, joining earlier tightening by South Africa, Namibia, Rwanda, and Tanzania. Rising oil prices, weaker currencies, and fresh geopolitical tension are driving the change. Therefore, for import-dependent economies, deeper and more expensive fuel quickly feeds into transport, electricity, and food, keeping the pressure on prices and on policymakers. Let's take a look at metals, where there is a trade fight with African implications. South African miner Sibanye-Stillwater is appealing a United States trade ruling on Russian palladium imports, as the company is the only primary producer of palladium in the United States and wants Washington to impose tariffs, thereby arguing that Russian shipments amount to illegal dumping at below market prices. Palladium used in car catalytic converters has fallen around 22% this year to about $1,285 an ounce, and Sibanye has already suspended parts of its Montana operations to cut costs. And finally, looking at the IMF, a new International Monetary Fund paper says artificial intelligence could lift sub-Saharan Africa's economy by around 4% over the next decade, but only with better electricity, wider internet access, and stronger digital skills. Without reform, the fund warns the gain could be as little as 0.2%, which in its words is an error. Meanwhile, with only 38% of Africans online in 2024 against 68% globally, the gap remains wide, but the price for closing it is substantial. This is all we have for you today on Business Buzz. I am Louisa Asidi. Thank you for watching.